David Bentley Hart is regarded as one of America's brightest theologians, with a rare mix of expertise in literature, history, philosophy, art and culture. He's a prolific author who writes with authority and wit. His work is brilliant. In 2009, Bentley Hart waded into the debates around the place of Christianity in Western culture with his book Atheist Delusions, The Christian Revolution and Its Fashionable Enemies. In this book, Bentley Hart challenges the argument that Christianity has been an unrelenting force of evil, with its crusades, witch hunts, the Inquisition and support of slavery. So when I met him in a house in Baltimore, I began by suggesting that there is at least some truth to that popular perception of Christianity's failings. Here's what he had to say.
Undoubtedly, Christians have been remarkably ingenious at betraying everything that their faith putatively stands for. You can't deny that. The genetic attribution, however, that says that Christianity is the source of these evils is assumed rather too hastily in many cases, but you can't deny for a moment. And in fact, the historical arguments made by current critics of Christianity always tend to have more weight and to go farther, I think, than many of the attempted philosophical, metaphysical arguments, mostly because the former are obvious and the latter somewhat abstruse and often misunderstood by the critics of the tradition.
Is it really the case that we just need a more sophisticated reading of the history?
The history, as it's often presented to us, consists often in caricatures on both sides. Not only sort of the new atheist caricature of 2,000 years of detestation of reason and of women and endless barbarous internecine warfare and aggression, but also, of course, you get the opposite, the pious histories that refuse to acknowledge these things. But again, the question is one of causality. And often what one finds to be the case is that any sin, any evil committed by a Christian person or a Christian people becomes an argument not only against that person or that people, but against the entire tradition of Christian belief and the existence of God, as if one can make a leap from that to the other. The first task is to make a close inspection of the history we're discussing and try to understand to what degree the interests of the state, or to what degree the interests of civil society, or what degree individual interests are involved in these evils, and whether that really militates against the truth of the gospel.
But shouldn't Christians acknowledge the crimes of Christian history?
Yeah, and I have plenty of acquaintances, some friends as well, who find it almost impossible to acknowledge, or even current institutional evils, which are no less grave in some respects than these more antique malfeasances.
Does it or doesn't it, as you acknowledge some of those failures, have any bearing on the legitimacy of the faith itself?
Well, probably in some sense, in that Christianity does claim to be a force that transforms hearts and souls, and the degree to which Christianity was absorbed into the apparatus of civil society and the state after the 4th century is in some sense a measure of the real power that the gospel claims for itself. I think, as I say, I think a serious argument can be made there. At the philosophical level, the critics, the current crop, the new atheists, who are, as a rule, somewhat less adept at philosophical argument, even the trained philosophers among them, than the great critics of Christianity of the past, are just unable to make the sort of arguments they would like to make. Richard Dawkins is an obvious example of someone who thinks he has good arguments, but simply doesn't have the training, perhaps the aptitude, but definitely the training to understand the metaphysical tradition. But the historical record, if he wants to argue on that ground, he has a great deal of material at his disposal, and that's an argument one can engage in good faith. Try to correct his misapprehensions, acknowledge what he gets right, and then at the end of the day ask, but what does that mean about the system of belief, the moral content, the question of God, the question of the absolute. And for some reason these things tend to get inextricably tangled up. The best example among the new atheists of this is Christopher Hitchens, who just does not make distinctions anywhere. You know, there is something called religion, and it is responsible for every evil everywhere, and even those which are manifestly not religious. I was disappointed by that. I enjoy reading Christopher Hitchens, but in his book God is Not Great, there's a chapter whose title proclaims that the metaphysical picture of reality offered by religion is false, and then one looks in vain in the pages of that chapter for a metaphysical argument. And, you know, I think the points where it's not clear what exactly it is he's arguing, he complains legitimately about the treatment of young women in India who have insufficient dowries that can be beaten and killed. But what does that have to do with the question of religion? That's a cultural reality, but it's not something you find in the Isha Upanishad or the Bhagavad Gita. And there's just this wonderful sort of flowing together of all things into one common ocean.
He makes no distinction.
None.
Welcome to part 2 of my interview with author and theologian David Bentley Hart, which records a conversation I had with him in Baltimore. Bentley Hart has been very critical of the so-called new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. I asked him why he thinks they've become so popular.
Well, for one thing, it's a niche market. I mean, there are 300 million Americans. You sell to 1% of the population. That's a lot of book sales. And so if they sell to 5%, they're in clover. But it's popularity. A lot of people share their resentment. I do at times. I mean, to be quite honest, I'm not in the conventional sense a religious person. I don't have an impulse towards clericalism, and I don't I creep reluctantly to church quite often. I have to confess, I'm not a liturgical person, which is odd for an Orthodox. And I resent the betrayals, I resent the authoritarianism, I resent all of that, and I can understand that. And so I even get a little secret frisson of pleasure out of reading some of the jabs at those aspects of the tradition that I find especially offensive. But also their popularity stems from the ignorance of their readers, to be honest, because there's no way that somebody who's sat down and taken the time to learn how to reason philosophically and gone to the trouble of learning the concept, say like simplicity as a metaphysical concept, is going to pick up Richard Dawkins and say, there's a good argument. In fact, it's embarrassing what he does, because he's just not interested in knowing what he's talking about, and at the same time thinks that he does know what he's talking about.
Certainly, I wondered about this part though. Dawkins and Hitchens especially attack the God of the Old Testament as a moral monster. Yeah. How do you respond to those criticisms? Because even Christians, if they read the Old Testament, find it strange and troubling.
What's the news here? I mean, that's the other is that Dawkins and Hitchens both hold up these stories, and Dawkins especially. So but of course people take the Bible is supposed to be understood as a moral guide. When in Christian history, it may be true in certain fundamentalist circles, we breed every kind of exotic flora here. So, but all the church fathers, of course we read this allegorically, and they didn't, and that doesn't mean reading it as if you believe there are messages encoded secretly in the text. It's just the ancient understanding of it. It serves as a spiritual text to the degree that the mind of Christians read it and allegorize it in relation to the truth that they believed was revealed in Christ. But all the church fathers, all the great medieval theologians, they were quite aware that the God often, of course not the God of the Old Testament as if there's only one depiction. I mean, the God of the prophets, many of the prophets, is much more urbane, let's say, than some of the patriarchal narratives. This is no surprise, and it's only if you think that the history of Christian exegesis takes the Bible, say, as a verbatim, the way a very pious fundamentalist Muslim is expected to understand the Quran, as a verbatim sort of set of oracles from God, that's a problem. If you do impose the sort of clod-hopping modern sense that, oh well, it must be that whatever the intention of the author was is what the text means, and that's how it's always been. Not only Christians, but pagans and Jews in antiquity wouldn't have known what you were talking about. That's just not how texts were read. That's not how they were understood. Augustine says this in the Confessions. The intentions of the authors of Genesis differ perhaps entirely from what a Christian is to make of them.
Welcome to part 3 of my interview with David Bentley Hart. Bentley Hart has argued that an ethical theory constructed apart from some account of transcendent truth is a fragile fiction. So I asked him, why can't humans construct a workable ethics without appealing to the spiritual?
Well, perhaps they can. Whether they must or not is a different question. That sentence was really just an exhortation to honesty. Intellectual honesty, because it's quite possible for people not to believe in God, certainly, or the good beyond being, and to be perfectly decent human beings, and on that basis it might be perfectly possible to create a society in which we interfere with each other as little as possible, and treat each other with respect and look after one another. But having said that, it just seems to me that there are a great number of rather facile assumptions that operate in a great deal of the more evangelically secularist literature that's on the bestsellers list these days. The truth is, we work with a model of freedom in the modern age that has a history, a theological history stretching back to the 14th century at least, and a secular philosophical history going back probably to the late 15th century, which defines freedom not in the classical sense as the power of a being to realize its nature by growing into greater conformity with the good as such. We don't assume we have a nature. We don't assume the good as such is anything other than a cultural construction. Rather, freedom consists in the unrestrained, spontaneous power of the self to construct for itself the ends it desires, and then to pursue them with as little interference as possible to the greatest extent of its power. If that's true, if we're working with that model of freedom, the pretense that there's just some obviously self-evident system of ethics out there that all rational persons will agree on because it's good for us is absurd. It may be. It has been. Catastrophically has been the case in the 20th century that they say, well, it's not interested in what's good for us. We're interested in what's good for me, or for the German people, or for the utopia of the future. And all the political products of this model of freedom in the modern age have vied with one another. There's cultural banality, there's monstrosity, the prodigies of evil, that the pursuit of the will to power, which is a sort of organically magnified notion of this idea of freedom, have produced. We don't produce greatness, you're not going to get the Renaissance probably without a tyrant or two. It's just the nature of human beings that greatness often comes about as a result of constraints and compulsions. But we could create a decent enough secular culture, although then we'd have endless and unadjudicable arguments about who gets to be part of that. Like, children that we might think are born handicapped, should they be born, the unborn, the elderly, you know. And there's absolutely no index of moral truth. There's no intelligible way of arguing these things within the context of what we understand freedom and the good to be. And just to assume that the future will look like what we in our good sort of post-Enlightenment way expect it to look like, if we're all good secularists, I think is worse than quixotic.
In part 4 of my interview with David Bentley Hart, we talk about what he has described as a strange nostalgia for a pagan past, where some critics seem to think that the pagan world was a whole lot better than the Christian society that eventually overtook it.
No, well, I'm a classicist in part by training, and I love the classical world. I love classical literature. But this picture of pagan antiquity is frankly absurd. For one thing, it goes back to Gibbon, of course, to claim that polytheism is by nature more tolerant than Christianity. It was more welcoming of it. Now, anyone who's really familiar with the time, you know that this is a rather silly notion. It was more tolerant of, I mean, a cult of a particular god and goddess might be perfectly tolerant of another cult, as long as they both belong to the same continuum of worship, as long as they fit within the sort of Indo-European pagan. And even then, there are all sorts of not only disagreements but actual violence. If you want a good example of interreligious, if nothing else, disdain, you don't have to have an example of violence. Read Apuleius's Golden Ass and see how Lucius feels about the worshippers of Atargatis as opposed to the worshippers of Isis. You know, it's all the difference in the world. But also, I mean, and there was real violence. Now, but also, you know, it overlooks the formidable element of melancholy and sort of resigned suffering that's part of the aesthetic and the moral and the spiritual basis of both Attic culture and, in some ways, of late Roman culture, to which the best solution offered in antiquity was probably Stoicism. It's the most moral, it's the most serene, it's the most wisely resigned, to which the most philosophically ecstatic response, though, was Platonism. But to be honest, the one thing that's clear, and pagan critics of Christianity regarded this as one of the unseemly elements of the faith, is that Christianity was notable in part in the ancient world for its kind of brainless cheerfulness in the eyes of many, and that if we're really going to make these vast generalizations about cultural periods, there's far more cheer. There's far more cultural emphasis upon good community and fellowship in the High Middle Ages than you find anywhere in the remains of antiquity. And it's not. And one more thing about the religious pluralism. Point I should make is that whereas religious cults could tolerate one another once they had become used to one another, what they couldn't tolerate and didn't tolerate, of course, were different visions of religion, different visions of piety, different visions of truth. Persecutions of aberrant sects, persecutions of Christians may have been sporadic, but they were part of the religious temper of the time. The Christians were considered atheists. They were atheists in the sense that this was understood. They fixed their minds entirely on a transcendent God, and therefore all the gods in between became otiose and in some sense malign. Seems a bit unfair, but you know, times change. But you know, Christopher Hitchens talks about that bright and vibrant culture that's sort of exterminated. Ultimately, as the result, the seed of its destruction lies in the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, as if the Seleucids are wonderful examples of religious tolerance. A.C. Grayling, someone I had hoped would be a good atheist, a cleverer one than his peers, but actually doesn't have any more cultural, historical subtlety apparently than others. In one of his essays, talks about be a small loss. Maybe we lose all those ages of Christian art, but wouldn't we rather see more paintings of Venus rising from the Paphian foam than of the Christ? Well, my argument's twofold. Along with that, of course, is a society of such massive injustice and inequity and sort of pervasive cruelty that if it were looked into very closely by the people who make these absurd statements, they would be ashamed of themselves. The other is, of course, that A.C. Grayling remark is interesting to me because, yes, I admit that Venus rising from the sea is a lovelier image than Christ being taken down from the cross, if I'm affectively speaking of sensuous, erotic interest. But isn't it interesting, though, that somehow the broken body of this peasant becomes the center of a grave and tragic meditation that can illuminate a world of human concerns? That you don't find in antiquity.
Alternative gospels have enjoyed a degree of popularity in recent years, some people feeling that they are a challenge to the texts of the Bible. But Bentley Hart says nothing dilutes one's sympathy for the Gnostics as much as an encounter with their actual writings. In part 5 of my interview with him, I asked him about what he makes of these Gnostic gospels.
Well, it is true that it's often disappointing, is that they're repetitive, they're dull, and sometimes a bit cruel. Now, this is true of a lot of religious literature, don't get me wrong. I don't dismiss Gnosticism out of hand. I actually believe there is such a category. A lot of modern scholars don't. But a lot of the concerns of the Gnostics are not different in form or even in content from a lot of Pauline and from a lot of Paul's speculations and concerns in the Gospel of John. But this notion, and again, you do find it in the New Atheist books, that the Christian canon is sort of arbitrarily extracted from an endless fund of equally plausible variant traditions is a bit silly. Most of the alternative gospels are from a somewhat later period. They're conscious constructions with theological purpose. Of the 4 Gospels, clearly the Gospel of John is a consciously constructed theological document. All right. The other 3 is they reach back into older traditions, logia traditions, those traditions of the sayings of Christ, and are more deeply grounded in the memories of the early community. So it's not that they had just the same authority as these others. And again, talk about alternative Christianities, sure, but once you dive into the literature, you just can't wait to get back to shore, to be honest.
Is it fair to say that Christianity, compared to that Gnostic view of the world, is an altogether much more positive one?
Well, obviously, yes. I mean, it is in many ways. There's if nothing, a kind of ambivalence sustained. The Gospel of John, the most similar in language and style to Gnostic and to mystery religion documents, still has to affirm that for all that it is under the rule of alien powers and all that it suffers and all that is suffered within it, creation nonetheless is good. It doesn't make that leap into the total rejection. Now, not all of what we call Gnostic literature makes that total rejection either, but most of it does. To me, it's a very sane and healthy equilibrium that recognizes the goodness of things, but also is not purely and can never be totally at home in a world of suffering and death.
In 2005, David Bentley Hart wrote about suffering in his book, The Doors of the Sea. Where was God in the tsunami? Using the Asian tsunami as a springboard into the discussion. In the final part of my interview with him, I asked about the issue of suffering and evil and how serious a challenge it is to those who want to believe in a good God.
No, that's the best argument of all. It's not an argument regarding God's existence or non-existence, because that's a question. First, you have to define what existence means, what God means. But it goes directly to the question of divine goodness and benevolence. Yeah, and it's the weightiest and the most powerful, and it's the one that actually is the argument that's adduced most often by believers. Famously Dostoevsky, of course, the rebellion chapter, especially in the Brothers Karamazov. It is far and away the best argument, better than the argument regarding the historical failures of believers, and far better than the metaphysical arguments, at least as they're generally made. It's the argument that holds most water for me. During those 5-minute patches here and there when I lose faith, which one should do with a certain regularity, probably. It's the suffering of children that occasions it, and that alone. There's no other single argument that I find compelling.
I wonder, do you get personal comfort from Christianity's response to suffering?
The Christian claim has always been, and how you place it within the context of a cosmology, is that in some sense the entire reality that we experience and that the entire cosmic reality we inhabit is a fallen, a damaged reality. And that book you mentioned on the tsunami was really just an attempt to clarify and distinguish between New Testament claims and a lot of the later banal and sometimes quite repulsive theodicies offered by later Christians. The sort of Calvinist argument for divine sovereignty doesn't really have to justify itself to you morally, or equally, like Richard Swinburne's arguments, forgive me, I hate to name names, about how suffering gives us opportunities for moral goodness, which, and that includes apparently the Holocaust.
So it's hard to make those sorts of arguments and stand with someone who's actually
and I think ultimately, if that's the calculus, then God comes out as evil. It's just no way you work your way to the end of these chains of reasoning without coming up with an arbitrary and in some ways quite deplorable picture of God. So the book, going to the Pauline texts and Johannine and the others, is simply pointing out that, first of all, this is not the New Testament picture of evil, and that's got to be significant for Christians, certainly, that somehow the world as we know it is under the dominion of powers. How we understand those powers alters from age to age, but the thing that runs through it is that you cannot look at the context of cosmic reality in it and see written in it the designs and ends of God in a straightforward way. That the Christian claim has always been that it is, Romans chapter 8, it is creation as a whole that is groaning in anticipation of salvation. It's morally compelling to me because a world in which the suffering of children were morally intelligible or necessary or willed by God would not be a reality worth inhabiting, and that would not involve a God worth worshiping. So the sheer defiance, the kind of rebellious, the revolutionary defiance of the principalities, the powers, the cosmic frame, the sort of almost ridiculous early Christian denial of the things that, say, Stoicism resigns itself to, it speaks to me very powerfully.
What makes you hold on to your faith?
As for the Christian vision of reality, the reality in which the human person really is this center of spiritual gravity, in which the God who is God is also the man who dies in utter abjection. You know, that is the story I inhabit. It's the story that makes sense of all reality for me, and the story that has been confirmed, not proved, by personal experiences and in reflections on history. But I can, if you're going to ask a personal question, I can also make a personal confession and say that I'm not a triumphalist fideist. There are all sorts of places where a healthy skepticism, both inside and outside the Christian tradition, should be operative, and especially in regard to easy moral confidence.